Digital devices, data traffic, sensors, and data centers contribute to making our lives smarter. In this lecture, we will illustrate how the complex dynamics associated with the diffusion of these technologies interact at the systemic level and thus affect our ability to reduce emissions. For this reason, jointly governing the energy transition and the digital transformation is very challenging. In the context of the energy transition, digital technologies are important drivers of innovation, competitiveness, and growth. They promote new business models. They provide new tools and approaches to optimize consumption and to improve efficiency across all sectors of our economies, particularly energy-intensive ones such as industry, transportation, and buildings. Moreover, the digital transformation increases the productivity of specific categories of workers and stimulates demand for new skills and occupations. Smartphones, cloud services, and social media offer new opportunities for communication and participation. However, producing, distributing, and disposing of digital technologies and infrastructures requires energy, generates emissions, and pollutes. Furthermore, the benefits and costs of digitalization are not distributed evenly across firms, sectors, or countries. The diffusion of these technologies generates displacement, productivity, and reinstatement effects in the labor market, and thus affects the quantity and quality of employment as well as wages. The digital divide thus exacerbates existing inequalities. These dynamics are complex and give rise to continuous self-reinforcing cycles, so-called loops, which interact with one another. This not only puts the energy transition at risk, but also affects sustainable economic and social development with potentially negative consequences. Regarding energy and materials, for example, digital technologies make it possible to manage variability and intermittency through smart grids and to manage energy demand through targeted interventions. They facilitate and enhance the integration of renewable energy sources. In turn, the diffusion of renewables further stimulates the use of digital technologies, which become increasingly necessary in a decentralized power system. However, new digital infrastructure and the proliferation of smart devices increase the demand for energy and materials and raise the cost of these resources. As a result, this raises the costs of digital technologies, hindering their further diffusion. The effect on energy demand and emissions is not clear-cut. On one hand, digital technologies help reduce dependence on fossil fuels, but on the other, they can increase energy and material demand. Along similar lines, important loops with implications for firms, competitiveness, and economic growth can be identified. For instance, new business models enabled by digital technologies can favor the concentration of capital and market shares in the hands of large firms, leading to increased regional fragmentation and potentially negative effects on economic growth. This, in turn, reduces incentives for the diffusion of digital technologies. At the same time, the new business models can promote collaboration among firms and the integration of value chains, thereby stimulating economic growth and international trade. When this occurs, investments, including those in digitalization, increase. Once again, the overall effect on energy demand and emissions is not clear in advance. Examples of similar loops can be observed also in the labor market. Digital technologies create demand for new skills. On the one hand, this leads to job losses in occupations that become obsolete, increasing inequality, negatively affecting consumption, reducing investment, and slowing economic growth and innovation, including digital innovation. On the other hand, digital technologies create new employment opportunities and increase the productivity of many workers. This promotes economic growth and reinforces the diffusion of digital technologies. Even in this case, the final effect on energy demand and emissions is not clear beforehand. In the social domain, continuous self-reinforcing cycles also emerge, illustrating the complex interactions between digitalization, culture, and individual and social preferences. For example, digital technologies amplify the role of digital influencers who, reinforced by artificial intelligence algorithms, shape individual preferences and contribute to forming social opinions and identities. On one hand, influencers can promote a culture of consumption and fuel a constant demand for services and digital technologies that, in turn, provide further voice and legitimacy to the influencers. In this case, the demand for energy and raw materials tends to increase sizably. On the other hand, influencers can promote dematerialization, energy sufficiency, and the sharing economy. In this case, the demand for digital services and technologies remains limited, as does the demand for energy and materials. Digital technologies also generate self-reinforcing cycles in the cultural domain. Influencers and social media can foster misinformation, leading to increased polarization and the emergence of fragmented, self-referential online communities characterized by reduced social trust. Once again, this generates continuous demand for digital services and technologies, further amplifying the influence of digital actors, with negative implications for all dimensions of sustainable development. However, it is also plausible that digital technologies can act as amplifiers of information that strengthen social cohesion and support the creation of a shared culture. In this case, a positive feedback loop emerges, fostering sustainable economic and social development. Once again, the final effect on energy demand and emissions is not clear in advance. What discussed so far highlights several key features of the impact of digitalization on energy, the economy, and society. First, it illustrates how the dynamics through which digitalization affects energy demand, the economy, and society are complex. In all cases, it is possible to identify loops that generate opposing forces. The pervasive nature of digital technologies and platforms is such that their effects, emerging in the loops we have seen, are rapid and far-reaching. Second, the impacts of digitalization are not neutral. In inclusive and sustainable contexts, digital technologies promote inclusion and sustainability. In contexts characterized by inequality, misinformation, and waste, they reinforce these dynamics. Digital technologies therefore act as systemic multipliers of economic, social, and environmental dynamics, amplifying pre-existing trends. Third, the overall behavior of the system depends on the relative strength of reinforcing and balancing loops. Reinforcing loops are those that generate negative outcomes such as increased energy demand, overconsumption, and social polarization. Balancing loops are those that act in the opposite direction. Fourth, the strength of reinforcing and balancing loops depends on the existing conditions of the system and on the interactions between technology, culture, markets, and governance. Importantly, balancing loops are often weak or underutilized. To be effective, they need to be strengthened through public policies. For example, in the energy domain, policies can promote energy efficiency, energy sufficiency, responsible consumer and firm behavior, demand-side management, and the sustainable use of resources. In the economic domain, industrial policy can support competitiveness and workforce reskilling, protect workers' rights, discourage excessive concentration of economic power, and support sectors and workers most at risk. From a social perspective, it is possible to regulate the digital sphere to ensure inclusiveness and participation, and to promote policies that address the digital divide. It is evident, however, that without appropriate regulation and governance, reinforcing loops tend to consolidate advantages for a limited number of actors. This results in regional disparities, social polarization, concentrated markets, and the marginalization of smaller actors. Only if properly governed can digitalization become a strategic lever for a just and sustainable transition. In the next lecture, we will examine in greater depth how to govern these complex dynamics.